The sky was wide and pale over the small frontier town when the lonely rancher named Eli rode in. His horse was tired. His boots were coated with dust from miles of empty road. He came only to buy a few tools, maybe a bag of flour, and ride back before sundown. He liked silence more than words. Ever since the war had taken too much from him, Eli preferred the company of his horses and the whisper of wind across dry grass. But that morning would not be silent for long. He heard it before he saw it. A cry, faint and shaky, the kind that made the heart stop for a second. It came from near the auction stand beside the sheriff's office. The sound of a child crying always made him uneasy. He slowed his horse and looked. A small crowd had gathered. People were shouting numbers, laughing, throwing coins into the dirt. For a moment he thought it was some trading of cattle or horses. But when he saw who stood on the platform, his breath caught in his chest. A woman stood there, holding two small children close to her side. Her dress was torn at the edge, her hair tangled by the wind. The children clung to her skirt, both barefoot, both pale with fear. The sheriff stood beside them, reading from a paper. "Debt unpaid," the sheriff said loudly. "Property of the late Thomas Hale, widow and her two children, starting at $5. The crowd laughed as if it was a joke. Some muttered things about misfortune. Others turned away, pretending not to care. The woman tried to keep her chin high, though her face was thin and tired. Her lips trembled, but she did not cry. The children pressed their faces into her dress. Eli felt something twist deep inside him. He hadn't felt that kind of pain in years. Not since his own wife had passed during the fever season. Not since he had buried their only child on the hill behind his ranch. He remembered the look in his wife's eyes that night, the same helpless look he now saw in the widow's face. "Please save the children," she cried suddenly, her voice breaking through the noise. The words made everyone pause for a heartbeat. Even the sheriff lowered his paper for a moment. But then the murmuring started again, cruel whispers that cut through the dusty air. No one stepped forward. Eli sat still on his horse, his hands gripping the reins. He didn't plan to get involved. He never did. He told himself it was none of his business, that the world had always been cruel. But when the sheriff shouted again, $5! Will no one pay $5? Something inside Eli refused to stay quiet. He swung his leg over the saddle and stepped down. The sound of his boots on the dry ground turned a few heads. The crowd parted a little as he walked toward the platform. The sheriff squinted at him. "You here for the widow?" he asked, half mocking. Eli looked at the woman. Her eyes met his, scared but strong, as if she dared not hope. He looked at the children. A little boy with big brown eyes and a girl who looked no older than 6. He turned to the sheriff and said simply, "How much?" $5, the sheriff repeated. Eli reached into his coat and pulled out a few worn bills. "That's enough?" The sheriff nodded slowly, still surprised. Eli handed him the money, and the crowd began to whisper again. No one laughed now. The rancher stepped closer, unfastened the rope tied to the widow's wrist, and dropped it on the ground. "You're free now," he said quietly. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She could barely speak. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. Eli looked at her for a moment, then at the children. "Because no one else would," he said. He bent down, lifted the little boy into his arms, and reached out a hand for the girl. "Come on," he said gently. The girl hesitated for only a second before taking his hand. The widow followed, still in shock, as he led them toward his horse. The townsfolk stood in silence. No one dared speak as Eli helped the widow onto the saddle and handed her the boy. He lifted the girl in front of him and took the reins. The sheriff called out something about papers and debts, but Eli didn't answer. He just said, "It's done," and rode away. The sound of hooves faded into the wide, empty land. The woman held her children tightly as they crossed the long stretch of plains. She looked at the man in front of her, quiet, broad-shouldered, wearing a dusty hat that hid most of his face. The air smelled of dry sage and wind. The boy had fallen asleep against her shoulder. After a while, she found her voice. "Sir," she said softly, "I don't even know your name." "Eli," he said without turning. "Eli," she repeated. "I'm Clara, thank you." He gave a small nod. "You don't need to thank me." They rode in silence for a long time after that. The sun was sinking, painting the desert golden red. When they finally reached a wooden gate and a small cabin at the end of a narrow path, Clara realized it was his ranch. It was lonely but beautiful in a quiet way. Open fields, a few fences, a small barn, and a single oak tree standing like a guard near the porch. Eli stopped the horse, helped the children down, and tied the reins. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "It's safe." Clara looked around. "We'll work for food if you wish," she said quickly. "I can clean, cook, wash clothes. I'll find a way to repay." Eli shook his head. "I didn't buy you," he said in a calm voice. "I just didn't want to see children left like that." Her eyes softened. "Still, you saved us." He looked away toward the horizon. "Maybe," he said, "but I think I just remembered something I almost forgot." Inside the cabin, Eli lit the lamp and made a small fire. The children huddled near it, their faces glowing in the light. He brought them bread and milk from the kitchen shelf, setting it quietly before them. They ate with small bites, too polite to ask for more, though their hunger was clear. Clara tore her piece of bread and gave half to her daughter. Eli sat by the window watching the flames. He could hear their whispers, one soft, tired, grateful. For the first time in years, his home wasn't silent. When the fire burned low, Clara helped the children onto a pile of blankets. She looked at Eli and said softly, "You live here alone?" He nodded. "For some time now." "Then tonight," she said, "you're not alone anymore." Eli didn't answer. He just watched the children sleep, their breathing slow and peaceful. The sound reminded him of nights long ago when his own house was full of life. A warmth stirred in his chest, strange but not unpleasant. Outside, the wind blew softly through the grass. The moon rose high over the hills, lighting the cabin roof in silver. Eli stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the cool air. He looked up at the stars, the same stars he used to wish on as a boy, and thought about how $5 simple had changed everything. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether the woman and her children would stay or move on, but something in his heart told him he would not let harm touch them again. When he returned inside, Clara had fallen asleep beside her children, one arm resting protectively over them. The fire's glow touched her face, showing the quiet strength beneath her tiredness. Eli stood there for a long time, then quietly placed his old wool coat over her shoulders before sitting down again. For years he had lived in silence, afraid to remember what it meant to care for someone. But that night in the little cabin on the empty plains, Eli realized that sometimes salvation didn't come with thunder or light. It came with a whisper, with a small voice crying, "Please, save the children," and a man who finally listened. He looked once more at the sleeping family, then turned his gaze back to the fire. Somewhere deep within, he felt a peace he hadn't known since before the war. The lonely rancher had stopped that day for only a moment, but that moment had changed the rest of his life. The next morning, the ranch woke slowly under the soft light of dawn. Birds chirped in the trees, and the wind carried the scent of dry grass and earth. Eli rose early, as he always did, to check on the animals before the sun climbed too high. The quiet of the morning was different now, not empty and still, but alive with little sounds. The children were already awake, rubbing their eyes, whispering to each other as they sat by the window, watching the horses in the corral. Clara stirred from the blankets and smiled softly at them. She stretched her arms and whispered, "Come on, little ones. It's time to start the day." Her voice was gentle, yet there was a quiet strength to it. She had already learned to carry herself with dignity, even after all the hardships she had endured. She looked toward Eli, who was checking the fences. He nodded slightly, the kind of silent agreement that showed trust and understanding. The children ran to the kitchen to find bread and milk waiting, prepared with care by Clara. They ate quickly but neatly, careful not to make a mess. Eli watched them, standing near the door, hands on his hips. He noticed how the little boy's eyes sparkled in the morning light, and how the girl's laughter, soft and melodic, filled the room. For the first time in a long while, he felt warmth spread in his chest, a feeling he hadn't recognized in years. After breakfast, Eli gave the children small chores to help with the animals. The boy carried water to the chickens while the girl gathered eggs from the henhouse. Clara guided them patiently, showing them how to handle the animals gently. Eli moved among them quietly, occasionally correcting a step or lending a hand. There was no rush, no anger, only the rhythm of work and the satisfaction of small accomplishments. By midday, the sun was high and the land stretched golden under its light. Eli had been repairing a fence when he noticed Clara walking with the children to the orchard. She carried a basket to collect fruit that had fallen overnight. He paused and watched her from a distance, noting the careful way she held her children's hands and encouraged them. There was something about her that was strong yet kind, and he admired it silently. "Eli," Clara called softly. "Come see what they found." He walked over, brushing dust from his pants. The children ran to him, holding out apples they had picked from the orchard floor. They laughed with pride, showing how careful they had been. Clara smiled and said, "They are learning fast, aren't they?" "Yes," Eli replied simply, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He accepted the apples, nodding to the children. "Good work." The afternoon brought a light breeze, carrying the sound of the river that ran near the edge of the ranch. Eli showed the children how to carry water safely from the river and how to tend to the small garden he kept for vegetables. Clara followed close behind, making sure the children did not tire too quickly. The tasks were simple, but they taught responsibility and cooperation. As the day wore on, the children's laughter became more frequent, more genuine. The boy ran ahead to chase a rabbit. The girl followed with a small stick to guide it safely back to the brush. Clara watched, amused, her hands on her hips. Eli shook his head, smiling faintly, thinking about how different life had become. Only yesterday they had been strangers on a platform, facing a cruel and uncertain fate. Now they were part of his world, a world he had thought too quiet, too lonely for such joy. When the work was done, they gathered near the cabin. Clara began preparing the evening meal while Eli tended to the fire. The children helped as best they could, setting plates and cups. The smell of cooked vegetables, fresh bread, and stew filled the small room. It was a simple meal, but it carried warmth, comfort, and a sense of belonging that no money could buy. After eating, the children ran outside to play, their laughter echoing over the fields. Clara joined them, guiding their games and making sure they stayed safe. Eli sat on the porch steps watching, his hands resting on his knees. He realized how quiet his life had been before, not lonely by choice, but because he had closed himself off from the world. Now, for the first time in many years, he felt needed, wanted, and alive. Evening fell slowly, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and deep purple. The children were tired from the day's work and play. Clara helped them bathe in the small wash basin outside, using warm water from the fire-heated kettle. They giggled as they splashed and played, the tension of fear and worry from the previous days slowly melting away. Once the children were cleaned and dressed, Clara tucked them into the blankets by the fire. She sat with them, stroking their hair and whispering soothing words until their breathing became steady and calm. Eli watched silently, feeling an unfamiliar tenderness. These were not just strangers he had helped. They were a family in need of protection, care, and love. Later, when the children were asleep, Clara approached Eli. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "You didn't have to do this. You could have ridden away and left us in that town." Eli looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "I couldn't," he said simply. "No one should have to live like that, not children, not anyone." Clara nodded, understanding more than he could know. "We will work hard," she said. "We will help. We want to make this place a home, too." Eli smiled faintly, a rare gesture for a man of few words. "Then we will make it a home together," he said. The following days settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings began with chores for everyone. The children carried water, fed the animals, and helped with small tasks in the garden. Clara cleaned the cabin, cooked meals, and mended clothes while Eli tended to the larger work, fixing fences, repairing barns, and making sure the land was productive. Evenings brought rest and stories by the fire. Eli began to tell the children about the plains, about the animals, about the world he knew. He spoke simply, but with care, and the children listened intently, hanging on every word. Weeks passed, and the bonds between them grew stronger. The children learned quickly, their confidence building as they mastered small tasks. Clara became more than a helper. She became a friend, a partner in the quiet work of running a ranch. Eli found himself opening his heart in ways he hadn't imagined possible. He laughed more often, spoke more kindly, and allowed himself to feel the happiness of having a family, even if it had come from a moment of unexpected courage. One evening, a storm rolled over the plains. Rain fell in heavy sheets, lightning flashed across the sky, and the wind howled through the trees. Eli worked through the rain to repair a section of the roof that had begun to leak. He was soaked, but he didn't stop. Clara ran outside with a blanket, shouting for him to come inside. "Eli, come on. You can't do this alone." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "It's just a little rain. The roof will hold," Clara insisted, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the cabin. "No, you've done enough for today. Let the storm pass while we stay warm and safe." They watched the storm from the safety of the cabin. The children were huddled together under blankets, their faces pressed against the windows as the rain beat against the glass. Eli sat quietly, watching the fire and the family he had saved. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of completeness, a peace that had eluded him since the war. When the storm passed, the cabin smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. Clara looked at Eli and said softly, "You saved us, but maybe you saved yourself too." Eli looked at her, then at the children asleep by the fire. He nodded. $5 well spent, he said quietly, a small smile crossing his face. Life continued on the ranch, quiet but full of meaning. The children grew stronger and happier each day. Clara and Eli worked side by side, finding companionship and comfort in each other's presence. They learned to share burdens, joys, and the small triumphs of everyday life. The ranch, once silent and lonely, became a home filled with laughter, warmth, and hope. Eli often thought back to that day in the town, when he had stopped his horse and paid $5 to save the widow and her children. He realized that moment had changed him more than it had changed anyone else. He had opened his heart, and in doing so, he had found the family he never thought he would have again. And so, under the endless plains and wide open sky, the lonely rancher, the brave widow, and her 2 children built a life together. They faced the hardships of the land with courage, celebrated small victories, and found joy in each other's company. The ranch, once quiet and empty, now echoed with laughter and love, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could change lives forever.